Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series on the history of bad ideas, I'm talking to the historian Marc Palen about the idea of monopoly. And as promised, we will talk about the board game, but we're mainly going to be talking about the arguments that are sometimes made in favour of monopolies, but also the many different kinds of arguments that can be made against, including the arguments of, perhaps, the most influential, the most important political thinker you may never have heard of, Henry George. Mark, we're talking about an idea today that some people listening might think, well, obviously it's a bad idea. They might just assume monopoly, that's a bad thing. When there's a monopoly, someone controls part of the economy, they can raise prices, they can exploit consumers. Aren't we all against monopoly? So the first thing I think we need to establish is not everybody is against monopoly. So to say it's a bad idea is to push back against the people who want to say it's not a bad idea. But also, insofar as it is a bad idea, fighting against monopoly is really hard work. And the history of that is interesting in itself. If it's assumed that in a market economy you don't want monopolies, why are there so many of them? And why is it so hard to push back? The other thing to say up front is people might also think, are we attacking the board game? That's what they might associate with the word monopoly. We will get to the board game in this conversation because it is actually a really interesting part of this story. But let's start in the 19th century, maybe. We're going to bring this up to date and talk about Silicon Valley, where monopoly arguments are rife. But in the 19th century, what was the case for monopoly? Was there a positive case made for where monopolies existed, or was it more, this is the way of the world, there's not much you can do about it? In the end, people are going to capture goods or sections of the economy. Or were there actual monopoly advocates in the 19th century?
For most of this, although we can maybe broaden it out a bit, I'll keep the focus mostly on the U.S. context, where a lot of these issues came to be a big deal in the so-called Gilded Age of the late 19th century. And I think to understand the arguments for monopoly, we do have to sort of understand the context in which they were operating in. And as with the Gilded Age, you have this time of obscene disparities of wealth, the easy corruption of financial markets for personal gain, and political cronyism is huge in the late 19th century. And I think this is also a result of, I would say, 4 late 19th century developments. One is the centralization of federal power. This is something that happens in a big way after the U.S. Civil War. You finally have a truly united nation, and the federal power is increased accordingly. Not coincidentally, you also have the rise of big business, as we probably call it today. Third is this exponential internationalization of financial markets. You've got the transoceanic cables connecting the City of London with Wall Street and so forth that allows for a new internationalization of financial markets and the corruption that could lie therein. And then with all that, you have massive industrialization, which is obviously connected to all this too. So these corporations, these big businesses that are seeking monopoly are going to find that buying influence within U.S. Congress is going to pay dividends, quite literally. And it probably won't come as a surprise that the defenders of monopolies were those who directly gain from the benefits that come from it. And I think here's where we can get into how some people argued for monopolies. Some really kind of jumped through moralistic hoops to defend their monopolistic positions by emphasizing that the benefits gleaned from monopolies and the manipulation of foreign markets could be a net good. So you have like the Pennsylvania railroads, the guy who ran that, Thomas Scott, he always emphasized that it was immoral for monopolists to manipulate financial information to drive down stock prices. This is bad for investors, but good monopolists could manipulate information, could manipulate stock prices, so long as it meant higher profits for themselves and for their investors. And so this was a net good. And I think there's also this Darwinian survival of the fittest aspect that's coming into play here too, that I think helped justify monopolies in some cases. The Rockefellers who would say, the monopoly exists because my competitors were just not strong enough to compete. And so we are the strongest that survived. And so we've earned our place as the top and only dog in this fight because our rivals turned out to not be strong enough. And so I think there's certainly that element that's at play here too. But of course, thinking about investors and the monopolists themselves, what they're not thinking about are the consumers, as you pointed out, right? The higher cost that that's often meant for consumers when you have monopolies, the lack of choice. And I think the centralization of federal finances and political power that followed the US Civil War, the corruption that followed this too, made the making of monopolies that much easier. The Republican Party, which was the party of economic nationalism back then, dominated the national party system, showed itself to be quite amenable to making monopolies through protective tariffs, through corporate subsidies, through land grants. And they did so, and here's another way, I think, way of justifying monopolies back then. They did so in the name of national security reasons. And I think in that sense, it's kind of eerily reminiscent of how Donald Trump sometimes uses national security concerns to justify, say, tariffs on steel, right, in the name of revitalizing U.S. steel industry, perhaps even with the goal of bringing back the U.S. Steel Trust of the late 19th century in that case. But in the Gilded Age context, it was mainly the transcontinental railroads, I think, that took the cake here. They had this direct government subsidies, land grants, interest-free bonds that facilitated and expedited the closing of the Western frontier and thus the consolidation of the American continental empire. And so in that sense, it was a national security concern to facilitate the creation and maintenance of these railway monopolies in the name of consolidating the American continent.
So interesting because there are so many echoes there, actually, of some of the arguments that you hear today, the national security argument, the sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest argument. So I'm thinking of the Silicon Valley Titans and the way in which they say, well, we've got a monopoly because we're just better at this stuff than the other guys. And, you can't blame us for just having a better product. Some of the questions about corruption and subsidy, we look at these big Silicon Valley companies and we think, actually, you haven't got a better product. You were just better at getting government grants, all of that. But there is also the case that's made now, and I'm curious whether it was made then, which is it does benefit the consumer. So now there is a case which is economies of scale, vast economies of scale. Now we might say network effects and other more contemporary terms actually allow consumers to benefit. Because when you have a really big organization, that organization is actually able to deliver to scale. And the problem with a market which is full of lots of smaller players duking it out is that actually the consumer loses out. Maybe pure market theory says the loser will win because it will drive prices down, but actually you just don't get as good a product. Were there people saying that in the 19th century? Kind of, if you really want the railroads to cross the country, if you want big, if you want to be able to move oil around, if you want to be able to move steel around, you need these conglomerates. Those are the 21st century arguments. Were people in the 19th century pushing their luck and saying, actually, never mind stockholders benefiting? I mean, you hear that today too. If you have a monopoly, the share price goes up. But consumers benefit too. Was anyone trying to make that case?
I wouldn't be surprised if there were some, but I don't think any of the consumers at the time would have bought it. There was nothing equivalent to Amazon. Amazon is always one of those unusual ones nowadays where it's like, well, yeah, it's a monopoly, but I can get things cheaper
You get your shampoo delivered by a drone within hours.
within an hours, and it's probably the cheapest one you can get anywhere. And so that wasn't a case that would have been very persuasive in late 19th century America. That was one of the big critiques of the railway monopolies, is that they were able to charge exorbitant rates to use their freights, to use their lines. And so the consumers and even the domestic manufacturers and so forth who needed to use these railways were paying the price, quite literally.
So let's hear about the anti-monopoly movement, because the other thing that's quite interesting about this is, as you describe it, there is a sort of web of institutional and historical forces that are going together to lock these monopolies in place. And it does involve corruption and graft, but also longer-term historic trends towards internationalization of finance, the outcome of the Civil War. But ordinary people are not benefiting. And as you say, if anyone tried to tell them that they were, they wouldn't buy it. So it would seem like this was fertile ground for a popular, maybe even a populist, anti-monopoly movement. And there were anti-monopoly movements at the time, but in a way they're kind of strikingly, one word for it is fringe, but another word is they were seen as radical. This was a kind of radical politics, anti-monopoly politics. So let's talk about Henry George, who's maybe the most interesting example of this. Tell us a bit about who Henry George was and how he came to be a figurehead for anti-monopoly politics.
He's really a fascinating one, and I'd say one of the most influential political philosophers of the late 19th, early 20th centuries that has really mostly become forgotten nowadays. And he was born in Philadelphia, moved to San Francisco, where he became a journalist. He initially started off as a Lincoln Republican, but soon became part of this, what I'd call liberal radical opposition to monopolies, opposition to Republican protectionism that comes into being in a big way after the US Civil War. So he shifts from being a Lincoln Republican to this kind of liberal Republican, as it was known, and then ultimately a mugwump turncoat in supporting Grover Cleveland's democratic reforms, trying to cut out the cronyism that was at play here and the monopoly system that was coming into being. So that was where he starts, and then he ends up moving to New York City in the 1880s, where he ends up trying to jump into mayoral politics for a time as a labor candidate, unsuccessfully. So an interesting mix of journalist, philosopher, and politician even.
Was speaking on the morning after the Democratic Socialist won the nomination for the Democratic Party to be mayor of New York. And I don't think we'll quite get there, but it is interesting to talk about radical New York politics, the 1880s and now. The links are extraordinary, actually. So carry on with your story, but it does just frame it. It's remarkable, some of the overlaps.
And it's worth noting that much like Cuomo losing out today, even though George doesn't win in his first attempt at the mayoral seat, he does defeat his opponent, Teddy Roosevelt. So there are some interesting parallels there too, even if George doesn't quite win it. For him, though, and I think this is really fascinating. As much as there's the oil trust and the steel trust issues, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and so forth, who are a big part of this story too. For George, his main focus is on land monopolies and land speculators and the railways, who owned so much of the land, especially going out west. So this was his main motivation for developing what becomes one of the most radical ideas for reforming the capitalist system of the late 19th century that I think we'll see. I think it's also important to note that he was also heavily influenced in his conversion here to the ideas of Richard Cobden, the mid 19th century free trader and peace activist in Britain, Herbert Spencer, the political philosopher in Britain. And for George, he viewed land monopolies, whether it was speculators or the railroads, as the biggest contributors to this disparity of wealth that was Gilded Age America. And like Cobden, he was explicit about this. George supported the free trade in land, but even more, I think, radical than Cobden and his disciples. For undermining the land monopolists, he gave birth to what became known in the USA as the single tax movement, or Georgism more broadly. And this came about after the publication of this really, really popular book in 1879 called Progress and Poverty. And in this book, actually, somebody at the time said that only one other book sold more copies than Progress and Poverty across the last 2 decades of the 19th century, and that was the Bible. And George lays out this really radical idea for taxing the estimated or the potential value of land. And the idea here is that if you tax the estimated value of land, you can incentivize the land monopolists, the land speculators to do something with that land in order to produce the outputs needed to pay that tax or to sell it to somebody who would. So in other words, if take, for example, somebody owned a bunch of land in the midst of New York City and they weren't doing anything with it, they were just speculating on the land, waiting for the prices to go up and up and up. By taxing it on what it could be, housing, a factory, it would either force the speculator to actually build that thing and start getting revenues from it or to sell it to somebody who would. And so this was the idea of breaking up the land monopolists' powers.
And just to be clear here, when we talk about land monopolists, because it sounds a little odd in a way, we associate monopoly with dominance of a market, maybe not the total dominance of the market, but the preponderant dominance of a market. But it's not like there was one person who owned all the land in New York City. So is the idea here that there were these pockets of land distributed both rural and urban around the country, and the people who had them kind of squatted on them, and they were sort of untouchable in a way. You couldn't force them to sell, you couldn't force them to do anything with it. It was a monopoly in the sense that the owner was under no pressure to make it a public benefit in any way. Is that what we mean by monopoly here?
Exactly. The property ownership rules were such that there was really little that could be done to break up these, whether small time land monopolists in the cities or larger land monopolies out west, big time owners of land. And of course, the big ones here at this time being the railroads themselves, who were practically given massive tracts of land to develop or not for their railways.
And they were given these tracts by the government, essentially. So they would, in order to develop the railroads out west, they would just be given huge swathes of land. So it's not like a market operated, they went in there and bought this up in a competitive marketplace. They got it through connections. And then once they got it, they were untouchable.
Quite a bit of it was just given out to them practically for free, and then they were given essentially interest-free bonds to develop the railways as well. So just, the symbiosis between the railway monopolies and the government is very close here, and this is obviously one of the key issues at play. Yeah, exactly. But for George, then, if you could encourage this development, if you say started building housing, this would bring down rents for the poorest. If it turned into a factory, it would create jobs for the poorest. In that sense, it was a win-win. But you'd still be getting that revenue from this single tax on the estimated value of land, regardless of whether or not something was developed or not. And for him and his disciples, they believed that this single tax could provide all the revenue needed for a government to run, which meant you could get rid of every other form of direct and indirect taxation, including the main way of getting revenue at this time, the tariff. So the free trade and single tax movement are really working hand in hand here in their anti-monopolist tradition. And for the Georgists, including George himself, the end goal is not just a more peaceful and prosperous domestic system, but if you transpose this, extrapolate this across the globe, you have this new interdependent, peaceful, prosperous world of the single tax and the single tax only that dominates the system.
And this is the age before any widespread income tax, am I right? So it's not like he's saying, let's do this and get rid of the income tax. There was really no income tax. Government revenue was very dependent on tariffs. So this is the radicalism here. It's not, if you propose that now, let's have a land tax and get rid of all the other taxes. We have a heck of a lot of taxes these days. There weren't in the late 19th century such a range of government sources of revenue.
Income taxes were introduced very modestly from time to time across the late 19th century. It was attempted to insert it, I think, into the Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1894, but the Supreme Court ruled against that. And so it's not really till after 1900 that the income tax and direct taxation starts to become more of a revenue stream for governments. And so, yeah, when George himself is operating in the late 19th century, he's going after the main revenue stream, i.e. indirect taxation through tariffs. Yeah.
Did he think another either direct or indirect consequence of this would be the breakup of the monopolies themselves? So as well as forcing the railroad companies that owned in a given state might own a lot of the land, control transportation, but also thereby control a whole range of commerce. By forcing them to either do something with the land or sell it, did he think one effect of this might be actually that the monopolies themselves would break down? Is this a sort of trust-busting scheme, or is it really an anti-poverty revenue-raising scheme?
It's both, and I think a natural outcome he would see from this is the breakup of these monopolies because, I mean, who's gonna step in? I mean, is another monopolist gonna step in and start taking the losses from the taxes on the estimated value of land? No, right? So the idea here is, of course, they would be breaking up these land monopolies into smaller pieces that would then be developed for the express purposes for which they're good for. Some of that would be for farm development, some would be for factory development or housing and that kind of thing.
So I describe this as radical and also in a way fringe. I mean, it's not fringe, as you say, if this is the best-selling book after the Bible. This is a huge popular movement. But how far did it get into the heart of American politics, particularly at the federal level? So to what extent did this start to drive the agendas of the main parties, or what resistance did it meet at that level?
It's a really interesting question because I think at the grassroots level, it's a huge part of American late 19th, early 20th century politics, but it actually has far better success getting into the politics of, say, Britain at around this time than it does in the United States. So if you go to Edwardian Britain, the Georgist faction in Parliament is extremely potent, led by Josiah Wedgwood, and it's being funded by these American millionaire disciples of George, Joseph and Mary Fells, who he's a retired soap manufacturer from Philadelphia who moves to London and then just starts spending all of his wealth to fund the Georgist movement in Britain and across Europe and the globe even.
Was he a guilt-ridden soap monopolist, or was he? I mean, how did he make his soap money?
A bit, yeah. No, I mean, I'm not sure how much of a monopoly Fells had over the soap market, but
He was a Gilded Age beneficiary, let's put it like that.
he certainly was, and so guilt might have played a part in that, but him and his wife Mary are two really fascinating radical Georgists who transplant themselves to London and who are in no small part responsible for creating this Georgist wing within British politics. So Josiah Wedgwood is the leader of this, but they have some surprising successes. So like Lloyd George's 1909 People's Budget has clear Georgist single tax principles put into it. So they claim some successes there. The land song becomes this rip-roaring anthem for the Liberal Party for years and years to come, which is all inspired by this Georgist movement. I'm pretty sure the Liberal Democrats still sing this when they get together at some of their parties.
Is it their equivalent of Jerusalem? I didn't know that. I'm going to look out for that.
I think there's some YouTube videos of Liberal Democratic meetings where they're all singing the land song together. Leo Tolstoy, the pacifist in Russia, he's a huge Georgist. His nickname for Henry George was the Prince of Peace, which of course is also a nickname for Jesus Christ. So it gives you a sense of how far up there Leo Tolstoy put it. But he also believed that the single tax principle would just work wonders for undermining the serf system of Imperial Russia. And he helped undertake translations of Henry George's Progress and Poverty into Russian around this time too.
So in the Russian case, I mean, we're talking again about an anti-monopoly movement, but this is not Gilded Age rip-roaring capitalism. This is more like the monopolies that exist almost in a medieval sense, in which allocations of land and power just belong to people and are untouchable. The serf system is based on the fact that in most of Russia, the people who own the land own the people, and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
And I mean, yeah, in that sense, going after the land monopoly is going after the much longer standing monopoly system that goes back, as you point out, perhaps centuries, right, to the aristocratic landed elites, the gentry, and so forth that have controlled the land, not just in Russia, but elsewhere throughout most of the modern and pre-modern era. And in a similar way, Sun Yat-sen, the provisional president of the Chinese Republic in the 19 teens, is a Georgist. And I was really surprised to find that when Sun Yat-sen steps down after his brief tenure as the provisional president, he gives this press conference about why he's stepping down as president of the Chinese Republic. And he says, because I want to dedicate the rest of my life to spreading Henry George's ideas and principles to China. It just shows, this is just a glimpse of the Argentine Socialist Party in the early 1900s is this amazing amalgamation of Marxism, free trade advocacy, and the single tax movement. They're all joined together in Argentine socialist politics too. So it's really remarkable that the spread of this. Within the United States itself, it remains much more of a grassroots thing. I mean, you do have some interesting developments that happen. So the single taxers they try to turn Delaware into a single tax state in a very big way in the late 1900s, early 20th century.
Also ironic given what Delaware is known for today, which is the place you want to go if you want to register a ghost corporation.
No taxes whatsoever, right? Yeah, pretty much. It's a very, very safe haven for corporations. It's true. But they do succeed ultimately in creating a single tax colony in Delaware. And this is called Arden, which is about, 30 or 40 minutes outside of Philadelphia, just across the border. Actually, it was founded in 1900, so I guess it's its 125th anniversary this year. I'm sure there's probably some interesting Arden, Delaware celebrations. It still exists to this day. So they succeeded in creating some of these single tax colonies in Delaware and elsewhere. And it's actually in Arden where you have this really fascinating amalgamation, because one of the things that happens within the single tax movement in the United States is that because of this kind of international dimension of it, as well as the domestic reform dimension of it, the single tax movement latches itself onto the burgeoning women's suffrage movement in the 1890s, very explicitly so. They also become leaders of the civil rights movement. So Georgists become some of the co-founders of the NAACP. And then they dominate the U.S. anti-imperialist and peace movements in the United States. And so one of these people, though, is a young women's suffragist living in Arden, Delaware. She's one of the first colonists to join Arden, named Lizzie McGee. And she's thinks to herself, how can I devise a game that young and old alike can play that can teach and instill the values of the anti-monopoly tradition of Henry George? And this is what we would now call the world's most popular board game, Monopoly. And it's given life in the early 1900s in Arden, Delaware, in the single tax colony by this young woman suffragist. And she called it the landlord's game. She got it patented in 1904. You can look at the patent online, and it looks like Monopoly. It's got the railways, of course, very prominently in their positions in the centers of each of the sides. It gets repackaged in the 1930s as the board game we now know and love as Monopoly. Of course, I think maybe the lessons that the game itself was supposed to instill has gotten lost along the way. I think in theory, the monopolistic version of the game that we play now and associate now, the idea here is that who really wants to bankrupt their friends and family? Who really wants to see an entire board owned by one person, right? This is still supposed to be instilling the evils of monopoly. This is the intention, the original intent.
But the problem is, that's how you win the game. I mean, this is the challenge I'm having with it. It's a fascinating story, and I didn't know that origin, but it really is lost by the time. I think most people who play Monopoly aren't getting that what they're being taught is if you win, you've got all the hotels, you own the railroads and the utilities, and you can totally see the link. I mean, people probably can now see that, oh, that's why you've got the utilities and the railroads. And then, in your different versions of it, you've got the richest parts of town, Mayfair and Park Lane in the British version, and the original version was Atlantic City. But if you're meant to take the lesson from this, that having won, you should feel sad that you've bankrupted your family and friends. Most people, including most kids, do a victory dance when they've won.
I know, I know. Everybody loses. I mean, there was an alternative version of the game that was supposed to show how the George's principles could work by raising those that were the poorest out of. It was a much more subtle game that wasn't, I think, nearly as fun, and that's why that other version of the game didn't quite have the same staying power as this version.
Just as an aside, one of my bizarrest, this may or may not make it into the final edition of this episode, one of my bizarrest podcast experiences was when Ed Miliband hosted his podcast, Reasons to be Cheerful, in the UK. I recorded with him their annual Christmas special. And what he used to do for his annual Christmas special was to get people and get out a game that he played as a child, as the son of Ralph Miliband, the famous Marxist intellectual, which was a game called Class War, which was kind of like a monopoly for socialists, in which it was very clear which side you were meant to be on. And it was kind of weird and fun in a way to play this game, but you could see why it didn't take off, because it was really teaching you the lesson. So actually it was no fun as a game. The thing about the genius of Monopoly is if there are lessons in there, they are very deeply buried behind the competitive instinct, which is to corner the market.
And a similar point to that, somebody did revive the more purely Georgist version of the game. I think it was in the 1960s, 1970s. Some economist in the United States does revitalize. He fought for the rights to it, and you can buy it on eBay. It's called Anti-Monopoly. Obviously, didn't have the success once again that you might think of, but it can be played, but probably for the same reasons that Class Struggle didn't quite make it out. It's interesting and it is educational, but yeah.
It's a little didactic. My memory of playing Class War with Ed Miliband was it was a little heavy-handed. So to get back, I mean, that in itself is such a fascinating sort of side story to the main story. To take it back to the early 20th century in the United States, and then I want to talk a bit more about the international context. So the other thing that happens in early 20th century politics is Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy, the person you mentioned that George defeated. So what was the context there? So George, was Roosevelt standing to be mayor of New York, and they both lost to the successful candidate?
That's right. Yeah. Yes. It was just, yeah, it was one of Roosevelt's early forays into politics.
But Roosevelt became a trust buster. So there's the antitrust movement, the breaking up of the big monopolies as part of what we can broadly call, I guess, progressive politics. And it's bipartisan in a way. I mean, Roosevelt moves from a Republican to creating his own party, but it then moves across to, it's established then in Democratic Party politics too. And that idea that by the early 20th century, American politics did need weapons to take on the power of Standard Oil, the big trust, the steel trust, and so on in mainstream politics. Is that an echo of Georgism? Is it distinct from Georgism when it becomes part of the mainstream of American politics at the federal level? Is this actually the sort of Georgism tamed, or is it something different?
I would say it's very different because actually I came across a really fascinating reminiscence of George about one of the first times, maybe the first time he ever met Teddy Roosevelt. And Henry George was giving a speech that was known as an American Cobden Club in New York called the New York Free Trade Club in the early 1880s. And George was giving one of his speeches on his philosophy and his defense of free trade and anti-monopoly activism. And he loses track of what he was saying because there was somebody behind him on the stage that was clapping so hard in favor of what he was saying. And he looks back and there was this buck-toothed, bespectacled young Teddy Roosevelt just going crazy supporting George's speech here in the early 1880s. But within a few years, I mean, Roosevelt ultimately is a very canny politician. And at the 1884 Republican National Convention, he abandons that liberal, radical strand of anti-monopoly free trade activism that he was involved in early on to become part of the mainstream Republican Party, the party of protectionism. And so I think that's an important context for understanding his trust-busting efforts in the early 1900s as president. And similarly, with what begins with the 1890 Sherman Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting efforts in the early 1900s. These are, they lack sharp teeth, shall we say.
And presumably they lack a land tax for a start.
Yes, absolutely right. They lack a land tax. So if we want to call this centrist, maybe that's about right. These attempted antitrust reforms, anti-monopoly reforms of the 1890s, early 1900s by the Republican Party, again, the party that has the most political power at this time. But it doesn't go very far. And at least at this point, it's very toothless. And I don't think that's surprising. Again, if you think about how the Republican Party is the party of big business, it is the party of protective tariffs. It shouldn't surprise people that their efforts to undermine the trust are a little lackluster, shall we say.
And yet they're remembered today. People today who want to say take on Silicon Valley, they say, look at what Roosevelt managed to achieve. It's held up. I mean, Georgism, as you say, and it's extraordinary as you describe its influence and its scope, the extent to which it's been forgotten. But people say, look, in the early 20th century, at the end of the Gilded Age, the American state, including the Republican Party, recognized it had to do something about this, and it found the political will and the political means to do it, so we can do it today. That is still held up as an example of what is possible in the face of these monopoly powers in business and connected to government. So do you think, in a way, actually, we're slightly oversold on Roosevelt's trust busting and have neglected the really, not just radical, but really popular version of it that got buried?
I mean, I'd say so. I don't want to push it as far as some historians have, but there is something rather persuasive about how some of the more radical historians have interpreted this trust busting effort. These centrist anti-monopoly reforms of Roosevelt as president, how they did just enough to snuff out the most radical left-wing critiques and efforts to reform the system. Did just enough to quiet the loudest critics of big business without calling for revolution, if you will. And so therefore it paved the way for the collapse of progressivism in his half-hearted efforts at antitrust work. And it paved the way for the rise of a conservative politics after the First World War. There is something to this. And I mean, I think this is a far cry too, as you point out, from these left-wing critiques of the Georgists. It's a far cry from the radical critiques coming from these journalists, radicals, the muckrakers. Listeners probably are familiar with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which was meant to expose the inhumane conditions of the U.S. Meat Trust and to break up the U.S. Meat Trust.
And I should also point out his later book, Oil, which is the basis for There Will Be Blood. I did a podcast about that earlier on. It's that story.
What might surprise people is that Upton Sinclair was a defender of Henry Georgism. Again, these two movements are working very closely together. Not every muckraker was necessarily a Georgist, but in the case of Upton Sinclair, he was a self-described Georgist throughout most of his early 1900s. But I also think it would be misleading to describe the anti-monopoly tradition as purely a left-wing pastime. And so, I mean, if I don't want to jump too far ahead here, but I mean, I think it is important to note that there are, people like Frederick Hayek were also concerned about monopolies. There are conservative economists, politically leaning conservative economists who are also anti-monopoly, of course, in the 20th century. And even nowadays, there's some conservative economists who seem to be rediscovering Henry George's ideas in interesting ways. But I do think it's fair, at least for the late 19th, early 20th century, and maybe we come back to the present day, that this is mostly a left-wing tradition, at least especially in the United States context of these liberal radicals of George's followers, and of course some of the more radical Marxist critiques of monopoly capitalism that are prevalent not just in the United States, but at the international level too.
What was the relationship between Georgism and Marxism? Was there thought to be an overlap there? Or in the end, was Marxism too much of a statist doctrine to fit comfortably with Georgism? I mean, of course, Marxism in its original form is about getting rid of the state. And I want to come on to that question because the state's monopoly is interesting here. But did it influence significantly Marxist thinkers in this period?
Well, I think to the great consternation of most Georgists of the early 1900s, there is a common mistaken association between the single tax movement, which still protected private property ownership and the capitalist system, and this very similar contemporaneous land nationalization movement that was happening from the socialist side. It does lead to a lot of confusion. But ultimately, as a result of that confusion, you do start seeing a lot of socialist internationalists joining up in what are predominantly Georgist organizations. So there really is this sort of fascinating symbiosis of Georgism and socialist internationalism, not necessarily Marxist revolutionary activists, but there are a handful of those involved in some of the U.S. Organizations that I've looked at too. But I'd say where there's overlap, I think we should turn to the liberal radical theories of monopoly capitalism of J.A. Hobson in Imperialism: A Study. He's not necessarily a Georgist, but they're both drawing on the same tradition going back to the Cottonites and the Smithian ideas. And his idea of theory of monopoly capitalism, which is then very influential, explicitly being drawn upon by Vladimir Lenin and Imperialism: Highest Stage of Capitalism, which comes out during the First World War. And both of those theories, these extremely influential theories, are mostly concerned with the rise of monopoly capitalism and how that's connected then to imperialism. And so I think this is a really fascinating thing too. This again connects this domestic reform with the international. The way that both Hobson and Lenin connect the rise of the colonial expansion of the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa, the divvying up of China, the Boer War, Spanish-American War, and so on and so forth, with this protectionist turn in the 1870s, this protectionism of most Western industrial powers, this creates, according to both Hobson and Lenin, monopolies and trusts and cartels. This then creates market inefficiencies at home, overproduction, underconsumption, oversavings that leads to the need for exporting surplus capital to new markets. And if you can't get there freely, then you have to colonize them, right? So this is how both Hobson and Lenin are connecting the rise of monopolies with the search for new markets, the colonization of the world, and ultimately, at least for when Lenin's writing in the First World War, the culmination of this, which is they run out of markets to colonize, and so they turn on each other, leading to the First World War. So for Hobson as a liberal radical, for Lenin as a Marxist revolutionary, they both have remarkable similarities in the way that they're understanding the late 19th, early 20th century developments of monopoly capitalism and imperial expansion in ways that the Georgists are working along the same lines.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because for Lenin, the First World War was the war of the monopolists. That's the only way to understand it. I do then want to ask you how in Georgism and in those radical circles, the radical strain in that movement, they understood the monopoly power of the state. Because this is a really important question. Part of what's going on here is that the cartels, the business monopolists, were exploiting the monopoly power of the state. The state defined as a monopoly only actually happens at this time. So the famous Max Weber definition of the state as the organization that successfully claims the monopoly of legitimate coercion. It is a monopolist organization. That's the way to understand it. Did this radicalism stretch to anarchism in the sense that if we really think monopoly is the problem, that an organization that squats and has the ability to resist all competition and therefore exploit its power, does it lead, and there is that strain, and it would connect with libertarian thought in the United States. And if you're founding a colony like Arden, the United States is full of people who want to found colonies where they are separating themselves out from the dead hand, the dead weight of the state or a government that can force you, because of its monopoly power, to do certain things. Was this radicalism right the way through to wanting to break up the monopoly of the state? And as I said before, that is there in Marxism too, in the sense that the end goal of this is a stateless society. Or was the monopoly of the state recognized as a necessary condition of doing anything about the monopoly power of the cartels of the land monopolists?
I guess before I dig into the US context, for somebody like Hobson, he would have seen this shift from the kind of free trade era that was more peaceful in the mid 19th century that started with the overturning of the Corn Laws in 46 and the decades that followed. And then the shift to monopoly capitalism after around 1870 as unnatural, right? So for somebody like Hobson, a liberal radical, he thinks that, same with Herbert Spencer, that capitalism, its purest form, free market capitalism, is something that can still be had, and that monopoly capitalism is a perversion of that. And so you can reform the system. So it's not necessarily calling for a destruction of the state per se, but using the state to recreate a system that's much more efficient and prosperous and peaceful for the many rather than the few.
But in that, using the state's monopoly power, I mean, that's the thing. It does need still to be a state that can do it, if necessary, using coercion.
If I can, like to quote Homer Simpson or to paraphrase Homer Simpson, the state was the cause of and the solution to all of monopoly's problems, right? Like the state could be used to break up monopolies if it's done correctly, right? It could be used to inhibit them. And I think this is something that's happening in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? The progressives are particularly famous for wanting to use the state to regulate and break up the monopolies, even though the state itself was often complicit in their creation. And so, I mean, the anarchist element is certainly present there, but it is a minority current, at least within the US context at this time. Much more, I'd say, the anti-monopolist tradition during this period was about being pro-consumer, pro-worker, pro-peace, pro-peaceful competition, anti-imperial, anti-plutocrat. By the time you get to the 1930s, it's anti-fascist. The anti-monopoly tradition becomes very anti. So, I mean, in many ways, a lot of issues that have reemerged, I think, in our current moment in a very big way for these radical monopolists, past and present. So, but the state, whether it's the local, the national, or perhaps by the time we get to the 1920s and 30s, supranational states and governmental regulations become potentially the solution to the problems caused by state monopolies and state support for monopolies.
So let's take the story forward to now. We're living in another age, which is sometimes called the New Gilded Age. It's an age of huge disparities of wealth, symbolized by the wealth of the founders and owners of big technology corporations, which often seem to have literally captured markets in which it's very hard to get out from those markets, to the extent that governments themselves often seem dependent on these things. When people sometimes say, why doesn't the state take on Google? The answer is sometimes because the state needs Google to know how to use its power to take on Google. It's that sort of, the infiltration is extensive, but it's also, as we said earlier on, clearly echoing that early story, crony capitalism. And within the MAGA movement, never mind on the left, but on the populist right, it's often the language sounds late 19th century, not because it sounds like Donald Trump wanting to recreate the age of McKinley, but because, in the extreme's the wrong word, but the Steve Bannon version of the MAGA movement, crony capitalism, the intertwining of Mark Zuckerberg and the American federal government, Elon Musk and the American federal government. Bannon calls Elon Musk a parasite and an illegal immigrant as well. You hear those echoes across politics, but on the fringes. I mean, Bannon is still, in a way, on the edges of the MAGA movement. Are you surprised that in 21st century politics, there hasn't been more resuscitation of George and Georgism? It feels like the arguments are ones that are repeating arguments that were had at the end of the 19th century, but the focus does seem to be much more on the centrist version of this. Like, if we're going to take on monopoly powers, it's going to be done through the state, through breaking up monopolies. So Elizabeth Warren is kind of as radical as it gets in this space. And Elizabeth Warren, I don't think is a Georgist. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it doesn't feel like it necessarily comes with what you might get further to the left in democratic politics, which is a rethink of the taxation system, a rethink of the way that power and money works in the United States. But it doesn't seem to be calling on Georgism as its source. Are you surprised by that?
I'm not surprised in the sense that it's always remarkable how short our historical memories are. There's a reason why so many people are calling our current era Gilded Age 2.0. Like you said, with the disparities of wealth that are on display, with monopolies, the big tech monopolies everywhere. We've also got the duopoly of Airbus and Boeing. You have, again, very reminiscent of late 19th century defenders of monopolies. You have the Peter Thiels. Competition is for losers, he's quoted as saying, right?
He plays the game of Monopoly and says, you win when you are the person who owns the board. You've literally cornered the market. You've got that corner, which includes the purple properties and the brown properties and all the other ones. That's how you know you've got the best product, is what he thinks.
And it's that very kind of Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest at play in his view, too. I mean, I suppose there might be a slight difference here in that he's also maybe more focused on the monopolies that are created by coming up with a new product or a new idea that it's the first to do it. And so for at least a brief moment, you have a well-earned monopoly over something because you're the only thing that's able to do it.
Yeah, so that also has that strain which comes in a bit later in this story, which is Schumpeterian creative destruction, and the idea that actually the way, if you can get, so it's not Hobson, if you can get this market working right, it's not going to be peace and free trade and goodies for all. It's going to be brutal, and it's going to involve moments where what looked like established squatting monopolies get swept away by the new broom in town, which comes in. So we shouldn't be overly concerned by these things because they are relatively temporary. And you do hear in Silicon Valley people say, you think that we're safe and secure in our monopolies. We spend every day looking over our shoulders, worried about the next version of us who's going to come and eat our lunch, to which the response is, but when you see the next version of you, you buy it. I mean, that's how you maintain your monopolies. You're Mark Zuckerberg now. You're not coming up with any good new ideas. I don't think they are generating, they are big behemoths, these corporations. They're full of all of the inefficiencies and bureaucracies of giant corporate entities, But they've got so much money and so much power that they buy their nimble competitors and just hoover them up. And that's what you see with, their share prices keep going up, not because they are innovating, but because they've cornered the market in innovation by having enough wealth and power to keep hoovering it up.
Those are all very good points. Although I have to defend Schumpeter a little bit here from Peter Thiel's use or misuse. I mean, I think that's right about creative destruction, but I think it's important to recognize that Schumpeter's theory of imperialism that he elucidates in 1919 has a lot of similarities with Hobson's and Lenin's views of monopoly capitalism and the inefficiencies of monopoly capitalism that create this demand, more atavistic kind of aristocratic demands that Schumpeter might see at play here.
Yeah, and I think he would say that actually the problem was the intertwining of state power and monopoly power. That, for him, was what produced the First World War, essentially. If you can pull those two things apart, then you can allow the winds of creative destruction to blow through. What protects the monopolists from creative destruction is their ability to capture the state.
That's right. If you get rid of the atavistic elites' power over domestic and foreign policy making, then yeah. I suppose the recent DOJ success story with Google is something that I'm going to keep my eye out and see exactly how that develops and if there's going to be others like that. But the state of anti-monopoly opposition in the United States right now, any hope of Republican antipathy towards the monopolies of the big tech giants, to your point about Elizabeth Warren, let alone Boeing or Tesla, it was dispelled, I thought, at Trump's inauguration in January. That image of Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Musk sitting together at center stage, there to essentially kiss Trump's ring, the hundreds of millions of dollars that they poured into his coffers. And then I think we can expect not a new era of government regulation of monopolies or dismantling of monopolies, but deregulation seems like it's very high on the agenda on behalf of the tech giants. And if we're looking at, say, like when Musk was then immediately given control over Doge, what were the first things he targeted when he had control of Doge? He targeted the departments that were these agencies that were in charge of regulating Musk's own empire. So I think that seems to be where the Republican side of this is going. Whatever that populist element was that helped catapult Trump to success, and the Steve Bannons, on their podcasts are saying the realities of what we're seeing from the Republican side does not look like we're getting any sort of anti-monopoly movement anytime soon along Georgia's lines here. What about the wider American public? I mean, I think most Americans, whether left or right or center, would prefer to have a healthcare system, for example, that is affordable. I don't think most Americans are aware that most of those high prices for healthcare comes from monopolistic, anti-competitive practices, right? That's not going to help fuel the anti-monopoly movements in the United States there. So yeah, you're left with Elizabeth Warren. You're left with Bernie Sanders' longtime warnings of the billionaire oligarchic takeover of the United States government. You do still have the Georgist. Arden does still exist. It was really fascinating a few months back to see that the mayor of Detroit was planning on instituting Georgist principles to revitalize Detroit's center through a land tax. And I think there's a wider movement here, too, that we haven't quite touched on, like the international cooperative movement, this kind of fair globalization movement that has been very critical of this multinational corporations' control over world trade policies, the monopolistic control that they seem to have over international trade that we've seen ever since at least the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999. I think there's still elements of that working around, but it is very disparate. And Georgism itself, while still around, having a bit of a renaissance, is still very much in the margins. And so it's really remarkable that despite the fact that we have monopolies everywhere, Boeing, big tech, they don't appear to be going away anytime soon. And this is despite the fact that most of all of us think that monopolies are a bad idea.
And despite the fact that Boeing's planes have started crashing in alarming numbers, but that's probably a separate story. To finish, I just want to sort of highlight two things in a way that seem to me interesting about where we are now, which has echoes of the earlier story, which is to do with the monopoly power of the state, because it feels like both on left and right, there is a kind of conflicted aspect to this. So as you describe it, most Americans would like cheaper healthcare, and there isn't a clear enough sense that these prices are gouging prices caused by buried monopolies within the healthcare system. But part of the challenge of the politics of this is that it's quite easy for the defenders of the existing system to scaremonger by saying, taking us on is going to empower the state. You're going to get state-based healthcare. And pointing to countries like Britain that have it from the people who want to scaremonger about this thing. And we know what that leads to. That leads to the state taking choices about your basic health. Your freedom of choice is taken away under those systems. You're at the mercy, maybe not of corporate monopolies, but of the state's monopoly. And you don't want that when it comes to your health. And that kind of politics has been very effective in the United States, I think, to block healthcare reform, which is why healthcare reform is so piecemeal, because the bogeyman of this is the worst thing that could happen is you lose your freedom of choice because the state takes control. So in a sense, on that side of politics, people are conflicted about the monopoly power of the state. And then on the left, sometimes the argument is it that monopolies are a bad thing, or is it that monopolies are not put to the correct use? So there is this sort of feeling that, do we want to break up the big tech monopolies, or actually should the big tech monopolies be being used more usefully to block Trumpist propaganda by banning him from Facebook? You know, that argument that was had, actually, these are very useful tools if they fell into progressive hands. If only all of these big tech companies were owned by progressives, this would be a happy world. And maybe people used to believe that maybe Mark Zuckerberg was progressive until he turned out the wind blew the other way and he wasn't. So it just does feel to me that in this story of monopoly and anti-monopoly, one of the things that gets people in a tangle is not knowing how to think about the monopoly power of the state. Are we for it or are we against it? The feeling on the right that we're sort of against it, the feeling on the left that we're sort of for it, complicates the question of what to do about these other monopolies. And that feels to me like it is an extension of arguments that were being had at the end of the 19th century. Though in the 19th century, I think people were happier to follow them to their logical conclusion and sometimes go the whole hog, be anarchists, be radical land taxers. You use the monopoly of the power of the state, not just to break up trust, but to reimagine the whole way that public life in America might be financed. And now it's shrunk so that it's almost frighten people off the radicalism because I think they're not sure what to do or what to think about the monopoly power of the state. That's my sense of it.
It's all the more puzzling to me because the MAGA movement in particular is, in many ways, rhetorically at least, so anti-statist in its attacks on, say, single-payer healthcare or along those lines. At the same time, they seem to be defending the use of the National Guard in California and this big, beautiful bill that's going to strip away states' rights in a number of ways, the unilateral use of foreign policy without congressional approval, and so on and so forth. It's a remarkable contradiction here that maybe we're starting to see a little bit of a pushback on now that they're realizing that Medicare and Medicaid are going to be part of the things that we're going to lose, and suddenly they're remembering that actually the state does provide these things. And without that safeguard, what access will they have to the basics of healthcare? So maybe there's a bit of a swing back now that they're realizing what's at stake on the right. On the left, yeah. The point about using the government to regulate Facebook, or Facebook has to regulate itself in a way that the state can actually have oversight on, was something that was seen to be going that way. Getting Trump off of Twitter, again, depending on who owned Twitter, that seemed to be something that was feasible, some sort of internal use encouraged by state oversight. So, I mean, maybe there's a part of that left-wing tradition that's still hoping that antitrust laws and things like this, like the Google ruling, can still provide an answer through the state to help regulate, if not break up, these monopolies. I'm not sure how much people on the left are still okay with these monopolies existing so long as they're being run in ways that they're okay with. My sense is that breaking up this kind of control, say, of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, and the breaking up those monopolies is going to be much more beneficial than merely reforming them from within through state intervention.
And if the nomination of a Democratic Socialist to be mayor of New York is the beginning of a movement that ends with a Democratic Socialist in the White House, that would be a very interesting twist to this story. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but you never know these days, do you? You never know.
Maybe people will start playing Monopoly a different way too. And
Maybe class war or maybe anti-monopoly will be the Christmas present of choice as mandated by the new president of the United States in 2029. We have a new bonus episode coming out on PPF Plus on Saturday. If you would like to hear it, you just need to subscribe. Click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. It is a conversation with the historian of religion, Alec Rari, about his fascinating new book. It's called The Age of Hitler. It probably doesn't refer to what you think it refers to. If you want to find out what he means by the age of Hitler, you will have to listen. It is a conversation about good and evil and all of the things that lie in between. Sign up now. Just go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time in our regular slot, in the history of bad ideas, I'm talking to Shannon Valler about the idea that there can be such a thing as value-free technology and why that is such a mistake. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.